Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is our fan favorite guest, cousin Marko Papic, who needs no introduction. Marko and I disagree a little bit about the Russia-Ukraine war, but then we also talk about how to use geopolitics from an investment perspective. Actually follows up on some of the conversation that Rob and I had in the last podcast. Keep in mind, we recorded this on Wednesday, May 31st. I don't think a whole lot's going to change between now and then, but this is posting just a couple days later on Monday. So nothing probably too dated, although some of what we talk about with Marko in the podcast has to do with the Western Balkans and Serbia and Kosovo. And I'll be the first to tell you that that's a powder keg waiting to happen. So if something blows up in the next few days there, it doesn't look like it is. We're sort of through the end of the day Thursday, that time period. So I think it'll be okay. But if anything happens on Friday or over the weekend, this was recorded on Wednesday with the information that we had at hand. Otherwise, listeners, if you want to talk more about the wealth management services that we offer, if you want to know about our investment minimums, if you want to know about how to work with us, email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. We manage money for clients and in client portfolios. We also offer research and consulting services, not just to investors, but to multinationals and other types of corporates or individuals who are looking for this kind of geopolitical work. So, without further ado, here's the conversation with cousin Marko. Hope you enjoy it. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.
Well, it's a good thing that I have, like, the tower.
I was already going to comment on the fact that I'm staring at a tower of the books behind your face. The last time this happened, I remember, it's a long story, but I went into the dean of the ILR school at Cornell University's office, and I was there in my capacity as Hillel president. Now we're really reaching back. And he had copies of all his books behind him when I was supposed to be talking to him. And I was as unintimidated by him as I am by your tower of geopolitical alpha. Nice to see you, cousin Marko.
Good to see you, cousin Jacob. Yes, well, people keep asking me what's on your tower. What books do you have? And so I just took all the books out and just replaced it with mine.
I like to change the books that are behind me based on where I'm getting interviewed. So if you've ever seen me on Fox or anything like that, there's always an autobiography of Malcolm X right to the left or right of the top of my forehead. Right now,
Das Kapital.
Yeah, right now, you got some interesting stuff. But anyway, the listeners are not here to hear about what I like to decorate my office with. What's going on, Marko? It's been a couple months, and I feel like we're in this weird lull with geopolitics, but not really. Like the Ukrainian counteroffensive, not quite here yet. U.S.-China relations haven't really changed, even if Biden wants to say there's a thaw. Turkish elections boring. Like, what's got you going right now?
I think that, like last year, you could have argued that we got a bear market in equities because of a uptick in geopolitical risks. And many say that, like, hey, look, geopolitics matters. Ukraine war, coincided with a downdraft in the equity market, and you had uptick in China-US tensions and so on. But in my view, it had all to do with the Fed. And now I think that it is, again, all about the Fed. So sometimes as a geopolitical strategist, I think our job, if we're applying this method to the financial market, sometimes our job is to say, like, look, it doesn't really matter. And I would argue that even though I'm the author of the aforementioned Geopolitical Alpha, I would also argue that 8 out of 10 times geopolitics doesn't matter, especially on a 6 to 12 month trajectory. Now, if we want to talk about, the rise of income inequality in the US, the structural rise of China or the peak in China, like those things actually matter more for investors than they think. But on a sort of short-term basis, I think it's difficult for geopolitics to affect the markets.
I sort of agree with you and disagree with you. It depends what your time horizon is. Like if Ukraine's going to have a counteroffensive and they're going to kick Russian ass, like that's going to have market impacts as is sort of vice versa. And I mean, there are certain commodity flows also that those are very short-term tactical trades, I feel like. But if you have a geopolitical edge on some of them, you can do things. But I'm a little taken aback. I'm used to making the argument that you're making, so I feel uncomfortable even having to say that, no, like geopolitics, it can do things in the short term.
Well, I think we can just start off with Ukraine. Like I said very controversially last year in the summer that the Ukraine war is over for investors. And I was almost canceled for that. Like, how can it be war? Ukraine must win. And I mean, it's been 100% correct. The last bit of geopolitical alpha to harvest was going long euro and European assets in September. That was it. That was your last bit of geopolitical risk premium dissipating for the markets. Commodities were short for May. Non-oil commodities were short for May. Oil was a short in June. And then finally, the last bit of geopolitical risk premium that had seeped into assets was, oh my God, Europe is deindustrializing, it will die. Well, that was wrong. And then, obviously Europe has absolutely crushed everything, including your American assets. So by the summer of last year, the market had discounted the reality of geopolitics. And this is something that, you and I have talked about before. There's a objective geopolitical risk, which is in the newspapers, which is what most, like I would say 99% of people who claim to be geopolitical strategists, they focus on the objective reality, which is people dying, tanks being given to Ukraine or not, those things. But then there's the geopolitical risk premium, which is kind of the second derivative of this objective measure. So if the war is in stasis, the risk premium being the second derivative of it, if something moves flat, its second derivative collapses. And that is what happened basically in the summer of 2022. This war has not really budged since then, and then someone's gonna, call you or email you and say that guy's an idiot. The Ukrainians reconquered, Kherson, and I'm just gonna sit here and be like, look, you need a magnifying glass to look at the gains of Ukrainians and Russians in this war since September of last year. The war has clearly been in stasis. That's been the correct call. Nothing's changed. And I doubt that the Ukrainian offensive will be successful in a way to fundamentally change the game, which means that we're seeing the ossification. I mean, no, that's the wrong word. We've already ossified this war. It's stuck where it is. Nothing's going to really, I think, change that.
That's a spicy take. And I disagree with it, because what's changed is that both sides are gearing up for a much bigger offensive. The Ukrainians are training whole brigades and battalions for some new offensive, and they're getting tanks, and maybe they're going to get F-16s. I think it's an issue of timing, not that it's ossified forever. Now, they might fail. It might turn into an ossification, but I think this is more both sides sort of getting ready for the next stage of the conflict. But maybe I'm wrong. It hasn't sort of come yet.
So let's break that down. I mean, let's break it down. Like, if I was Kenny Smith, I'd run to the board. Let me run to the board for you here. Yeah. So look, I think one thing that I think I've learned from this conflict is that defense, like, we are not in 2023 NBA. We're in like 1994 NBA, and handshaking is allowed. You can beat the shit out of somebody coming into the paint. This is like Miami Heat versus New York Knicks. The game ends 72-68. That's the Ukrainian war right now. Defenses are winning. They have an advantage. And so it's been very difficult for Russia, purportedly one of the most advanced militaries in the world. It's been very difficult for them to, gain territory in Ukraine. Even in the early stages of the war, if you will remember, in the early stages, all the Ukrainians were given were some javelins. Mm-hmm. Even just that allowed Ukraine to hold off the Russian advance. Now, some 15 months later, Ukrainians have a lot more standoff capability. But, assuming that the Russians don't is flatly, I think, idiotic. I mean, Russia has shoulder-mounted SAMs, so they have the ability to shoot down aircraft but you have a litany of surface-to-air missiles with which they can shoot down those F-16s if the Ukrainians get them. And by the way, the Ukrainians are not supposed to really get any of them until the end of the year. So this offensive will not be supported with advanced air cover, which means that tanks are basically sitting ducks for Russian ground assault aircraft, which they have hundreds of. And they're very effective at using them, as they proved in Syria. Because that's all that Russians really supported Assad with, which was ground attack aircraft. So you have some tanks that the Ukrainians have received. We don't really know the full number. The total that we were able to kind of get from open source was about 200, which I don't think were delivered. Let's say generously Ukraine has 100 main battle tanks advanced. You're talking about a front line that's as big as World War I. I mean, I don't see how 100 tanks is going to make a difference. And so that's why I would run to the board and just say, like, look, defense is going to win. Russians are entrenched. Ukrainians are going to have to pick maybe one, maybe two locations where they can kind of focus their attack. But it's going to be very difficult for them to break through, just as it was for Russians to break through in a place like Bakhmut. And that's why I have a very high conviction view. I mean, it could be wrong, obviously, but I just want to be very clear. When I have a high conviction view, I will state it. When I don't, I won't. I think Ukrainians are not going to make a big, they're not going to make big gains. Now, of course, it's very difficult because that's a subjective point. When Ukraine reconquered Kharkiv, many out there said, wow, that's a really impressive, gain. It wasn't to me, because Russians clearly did not put any political, geopolitical, or strategic emphasis on Kharkiv itself. They were okay with losing that. And so I actually don't think Ukrainians did something special when they reconquered Kharkiv. I think the Russians were willing to give it up. It was nice to have. It wasn't a must-have. And so I haven't seen any true gains in this conflict on either side. Even on the Russian side, I think their gains have been pretty paltry, and they've been focused in areas of Ukraine that, have a pretty significant already Russian presence.
No argument that the Russians have failed, and you're right that that Ukraine hasn't really made any moves. And I wonder if Ukraine doesn't have to make moves right now, because I mean, the stand for Bakhmut, and the thing I was afraid of was that Ukraine was going to engage in an offensive that didn't have any hope of winning in order to secure support from the West and from the Europeans and from the Americans and the weapons, and being able to show everybody who's invested in them, like, hey, we can actually do this. Like, we're for real. And by the way, we're going to quash corruption while we're at it, and we'd like to join the EU too. I think what's changed in the last month or two is, I mean, the Germans have said, hey, whatever it takes. And Biden, he's going to keep writing the checks apparently for as long as he's president. So if you're Zelensky, maybe you don't feel the pressure. Maybe you're going to keep getting weapons from the West until you feel like you have enough hardware and enough training that you can do things. And I think the flip side of this is, I'm not an in-the-weeds military expert. We had Sim on here a couple weeks ago, and he sort of went down into the weeds. But I will say, if you start looking at all the things that are happening on the Russia-Ukraine border right now, I mean, today's news, we're recording May 31st, this will come out Monday, was, drone attacks on some oil refinery on the Russian side. Day before that, it's missile attacks here. Oh, there's some weird Ukrainian faction made of pro-Russian soldiers hitting here. That, to me, feels like information warfare, the Ukrainians trying to obfuscate whichever place they're going to try and punch through, so that eventually the Russians, are they going to go here? Are they going to go there? And they're looking to sort of hide where they want to go, because, as you said, they probably have one shot here to punch through. And if it blows up in their face, it really could be extremely bad. So I don't know. That's kind of where I am. But tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, I don't know if it's extremely bad for Ukraine, even if they don't do an offensive, or if they fail, or if it's not that impressive in gains. Russia has conquered territories that are important for Ukraine from obviously a sovereignty perspective, emotional perspective. I mean, these are clearly Ukrainian territories, so Ukraine will always want them back. That's why I think there is no peace deal that will ever be signed where Ukraine accepts loss of these. So I understand why Ukraine is trying to reconquer them. It's just that Ukraine has proven, the reason Ukraine, quote unquote, won this war is because it's a sovereign state, and that sovereignty is not in question. And so we have to go back to February 2022 and realize that it was in question when Russia invaded Ukraine, whether or not it would remain a sovereign state. They defended Kiev. They defended vast tracts of territory, including in the north, like Chernihiv, Kharkiv. This idea that like Russia was going to replace Zelensky, or this idea that Russia would get everything east of the river Dnieper, those are fantasies that have not come true. And so that's where, I'm not sure that the offensive matters. I think the offensive matters in Washington, D.C. Every time you talk to a policymaker in the U.S., they end every sentence with Ukraine must win. And it's starting to hear sound a little bit like, I don't know, it's like a thing we just all repeat. A lot of it is PR. A lot of it is focused on, retaining support of the voters for continued efforts and continued war on both sides. Russians are doing the same thing. Ukrainians are doing the same thing. I just don't see how offensive actions actually win in this conflict. And we can really break this down to the military tactics and the weapons available. It is absolutely laughable to think that Russia doesn't have defensive capabilities. Russia clearly doesn't have the command and control, the tactics, and the experience of offensive war where their supply lines are stretched. They prove that they don't know how to do this. But Russia is also flooded with sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, including some that, are damn near better than the Patriots. So good luck with those F-16s. Good luck with those F-16s. They're going to get shot down. You think S-400 surface-to-air missiles can't reach into Ukraine? Yes, they can. Russia, what are Americans in the West going to do? Help Ukraine by doing what? Conducting a suppression of enemy air defense operations inside of Russia?
No, we're going to export Tom Cruise and his training staff to train all of the Ukrainian fighter jets to be Maverick. That's what we're going to do.
Yeah, they're all going to die because some Russian guy thousands of kilometers away is going to press a button and a missile will hit that F-16. There is absolutely no way for Ukraine to conduct air operations near Russian borders. Let me just say that again. F-16s are like they're like a Disneyland movie. They're like a Disney movie. There is no way for Ukrainians to operate F-16s near Russian borders safely. This is going to be very, very difficult for them to do because Russia has sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems that can extend their range well into Ukraine. And so it's not about dogfighting. It's not about Russian Sukhois fighting F-16s. It's about some guy sitting in Russia, smoking a cigarette, pressing a button, and his rocket hitting that F-16. So that's number one. Number two, the tanks that the West is giving Ukraine without air cover become vulnerable to, as I said, Russian Sukhoi 25s, which they have thousands of. They are 1960s, 1970 technology. They are more than capable of just sending waves after waves of ground attack aircraft to attack those tanks. Not to mention that Russians themselves have javelin-like weapons and the ability to attack tanks. So the more sophisticated weapons that the West gives to Ukraine for offensive operations, I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to help. Again, defense is easier to do in military, in the military operations. And this is something you and I both learned at Stratfor, the place that you and I work together. It's not like we didn't, study this. It's not like we didn't focus on this in our career. And I would say that, to put it very bluntly and stupidly, anyone who's played the game of Risk, when you roll, like you're attacking my territory, I have 2 dice, you have 3. But if it's a tie, you lose. Why? Because defense gets an advantage. And this goes back to the medieval times. It goes back to when we started fighting as humans. It's very difficult to conduct effective offensive operations, and I have absolutely no reason why I would believe that Ukrainians are going to be better than Russians. The other issue is Bakhmut, is seen, who won Bakhmut? I don't really care because it's irrelevant, but I do know that both sides probably exhausted themselves significantly in Bakhmut. including Ukrainians. And I do think that numerical advantage matters. So let's just break that down a little bit. Obviously, Russia has, 3-4 times the population of Ukraine. But Russia has a political problem. Russians don't necessarily all want to go and fight and die in Ukraine. So mobilizing all those troops is very difficult. For Ukraine, it's not. They're defending themselves. They're fighting for freedom. Obviously, I think the numerical advantage of Russia is overstated, is what I'm trying to say, because political willingness to commit to full mobilization is very difficult for a country who's on offense. And eventually, Russian people will get sick of the war and the casualties. But I do want to say that Bakhmut drained both sides. And we have to be cognizant of that and be respectful of that.
Yeah, there was no winner in Bakhmut, and the loser was Bakhmut. I mean, it's gone. It probably won't exist in 5 or 10 years after everything that's happened. And I take your point about defense and offense. For me, the best example of this is, Israel's War of Independence in 48. How did they defeat 4 different Arab nations that were invading them? They had very, very short defensive interior lines. And they were able to move, very quickly from one front to another. Now, Ukraine is a little bit different, but it's still, when you're dealing with interior lines and you're dealing with attackers, much easier to move people around behind safe lines than it is to punch through somewhere and then sort of maintain those supply lines around it. I also just want to highlight what you said about Ukraine will win. I mean, it's like, God bless America, Ukraine will win, war is peace, freedom is slavery. I'll just leave that point there to marinate as it is. But
and I just, by the way, sorry.
Yeah, please.
Just really quickly, I want to go back to your list. I was just in Washington, D.C., and it was just shocking to me how this has become a mantra in the U.S. We all have to repeat this. And I think that's a very, very poor policy. This should not be the policy of the United States of America to basically try to convince itself through repetition of mantras that something will happen. Because then the U.S. cannot pivot to other policies that may be necessary, such as telling Ukraine and telling the government in Ukraine, look, I think we reached the point where we just cannot, at this moment, help you reconquer these territories. No amount of money is going to change that. The Russians have dug in. They have surface-to-air missile coverage. And, they've put artillery. They're not going to do to you what you did to them when they try to attack you. So how about we wait? And there are cases out there where countries wait smartly, focus on domestic development, and then win. Think about Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict. Azerbaijan waited for decades, used its energy wealth to acquire a much better, much more sophisticated, technologically, military than Armenia, and then reconquered the territories it had lost. So that's something that I would say. I mean, it is bad policy to use mantras as policy.
No. And
sorry
I don't know if that's true for the Europeans, but I think you have a point about the Americans. But you said the word eventually Russians would turn against Putin if they continue the war. When is eventually?
Let's talk about this. Another very high conviction view. Obviously, last March, we made fun of me.
Well, I think last March was when you made your high conviction view that he'd be done in 12 months. Or maybe, I'm sorry, I don't think that was high conviction. I think you were just throwing it out there.
It was more like a Charles Barkley guarantee.
It is, although you did guarantee that you would eat portions of Geopolitical Alpha if you were wrong. So it's nice that you have that tower of books behind you. You can just go eat some of the pages if you want. Oh, I'm sure. I'll
did I really say that?
Yeah.
But the 12 month?
Don't worry.
I don't know.
I'll find it. You don't have to eat it right now until I have proof.
We'll eat it next time. I'll eat it next time with some. Maybe I'll crumple it, put it in borscht. That would be nice with some horseradish. Horseradish makes anything go down, as I learned growing up in a Serbian household. But okay, so look, high conviction view. There's absolutely no way that there are no political consequences inside Russia to what just happened. I mean, if the numbers are even the numbers being quoted about Russian casualties in Bakhmut are insane, and I think that we in the West lack historical perspective. If we just hear things like 20 to 40,000 Russian dead in Bakhmut and just say, oh, well, that's interesting, that's a lot, but whatever. No, that's not a lot. That is astronomically high. These are figures that dwarf anything that Russia has done since the Second World War, including Afghanistan, which was a tragedy for the Soviet Union, and that in many ways caused, ultimately, Soviet Union to fall apart. So what I would say is that we're already seeing this. I mean, some of the things that the Wagner Group commander Prigozhin is saying out there in the open, are really unbelievable. And, there are rumors coming out of Russia about the elites being extremely uncomfortable with what's going on. These attacks in the border towns by supposed Ukrainian or non-Ukrainian, who knows, these things don't happen to great powers. And I think that this is clearly a sign that we're descending towards a Mad Max world for Russia. And I think if you want to talk about Ukrainian war being relevant for investors, I don't think Ukrainian offensive is going to be relevant. Even if it's successful, we will make a big deal about it in the West, even if they conquer, some big major city, and then we're all going to applaud and say, yay, Ukraine won. It's not going to be relevant. The only way Ukrainian offensive, in my view, is relevant is if it threatens security of Crimea. And then we have to, talk about nuclear weapons again and, Russian retaliation. But to me, the way that this war, Jacob, will be relevant is the political reverberations and consequences inside Russia. And, I'm sure that in the West, there is this view that Putin should get his comeuppance. However, we don't know what that looks like. We don't know who follows Putin, and we don't know what happens to Russia in terms of its ability to support the global capex push, which in my view is the most important investment thesis for the rest of this decade. Russia is part of support structure, global support structure for the global capex thesis. In other words, it provides the commodities necessary for the world to do all the things that it wants to do. Solve climate change through, explosion of EV use, solve supply chain, problems, diversify from China. All those things depend partly on Russia being able to dig stuff out of its ground and send it to the rest of the world. So I think that the stability of Russia, I think, will definitely be in question. And you know history very well. We can go through previous Russian wars that they failed to close, especially when they were on offense, especially when they were aggressors. Every time they lost one of those, there was a revolution inside of Russia in some way, shape, or form. And I would also, we can talk about American wars that didn't do well, such as Vietnam. It caused political consequences domestically. We can talk about, my personal experience. I can just tell you, growing up in Serbia, a succession of failed wars led by the regime of Slobodan Milosevic ended up causing an internal revolt against the leadership in October of 2000 revolution. So the comeuppance always comes in failed offensive operations. I think that's kind of a law.
But it's all about timing. And to your point about Russian history, it's sort of the combined loss in the war against Japan, and then World War I gives you the Communist Party and gives you World War II and the Cold War. The end of the Cold War gives you Pax Americana and the unipolar moment. So if we are headed towards sort of the third iteration of this is like the one part of Mackinder's thesis that actually does work. It's not that he who controls the heartland controls the world, but if the heartland goes to hell in a handbasket, apparently it's going to reverberate everywhere.
Yeah, but let's spend some time on this, because I think it's interesting for those who maybe are not as steeped in history of Russia. 1905 was a disastrous war by Russia against Japan. And disastrous. They sent 3 fleets to Japan, and Japan kept sinking them. And there was an immediate political revolt against that. There was a 1905 Russian Revolution. We don't study it as much because, the Tsar gave Duma more powers as a consequence of that political conflict. So, as a consequence of what happened in the Russo-Japanese War. So there was a revolution in 1905 in Russia, and it had consequences immediately. 1916-17, what's interesting is that the reason there was a Bolshevik revolution, and people forget there were 2 revolutions. There were 2 revolutions. There was one that removed the Tsar and put in the provisional government led by liberals. And the reason Bolsheviks came to power is that provisional government made deals with the West to continue World War I. That was what caused the Bolshevik Revolution. If the liberal government had done what the people had wanted, would just end the war. And this is where the myth of the Russian comes in. There's this myth in the West where we stereotype Russian people as being impervious to pain. I would argue that given Russia's history over the last 150 years, they may be the least pain-tolerant people in the world. I'm sorry. But they revolted against the provisional government that had removed the royal family in Russia. They revolted because that provisional government said, we will continue the war, and when the war is over, we will acquire territories of Austria-Hungary. And then basically the brilliance of Lenin was that he came in and said, hey, the provisional government, the liberals in this country are continuing imperial wars on behalf of the West. So let's have a Bolshevik revolution. I mean, obviously he made other claims as well. It wasn't just this, but this was a critical reason why Russia had two revolutions as a consequence of disastrous World War I. And so, like when I look at that history, and of course 1980s, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Chechnya collapsed the Yeltsin regime and brought in Vladimir Putin, who then resolved it in a very sort of hands-off, calculated, smart way, which he has seemingly forgotten about, which is he paid one group of Chechens to fight another. But my point is that if you look at history of Russia, you're going to struggle to find me a conflict that Russia won being an aggressor and that after they lost didn't cause a revolt. Now, in terms of timing, I think it's much quicker than we think. I think this is going to happen much, much faster. It's not going to last a decade. Obviously, my 12-month forecast was wrong. The option expired. I ate that, and that's fine. You got to make calls. But I think that political risks in Russia will dramatically increase over the next 2 years. And the consequence of that for global investors is that I don't know what that does to the commodity thesis, but I think it's bullish.
Well, I think that's actually a good point, and it's a way to get on a hobby horse of mine, which is you talked about geopolitical risk premiums, and that is what most people are talking about when they talk about geopolitics and use it. And even though I disagree with you sort of on the particulars of the Russia-Ukraine war and the offensive, like we can kind of put that aside. I get what your take is there. But I do think here, if we go back to where we started the conversation, geopolitics is incredibly valuable also from an opportunity premium perspective. And the thing that the Russia-Ukraine war offers in spades right now is opportunities. So if it's about Russian state collapse and it's about bullish commodities, like that's one. If it's about Polish equities, which have levitated since last summer, and I don't think they're done levitating, especially if they're going to go in and rebuild Ukraine, that's another. If these German industrial companies that are starting JVs in Ukraine because they want to build and service their tanks in Ukraine, they're just going to do the thesis of taking Russia and do it on a small scale in Western Ukraine, that's good for them. I mean, you can kind of start to see the opportunities that go through this, not to mention, what is a lack of Russian power in the Balkans, the South Caucasus, Central Asia do if you're willing to get dirty in frontier markets and things like that. So I agree with you that maybe the geopolitical risk premium is in, but I think right now, a lot of, and not just investors, companies, executives, they're in a fetal position being like, oh my God, the world is ending. It's going to be World War III. It's going to be nukes. It's going to be that, when it's really like, no, get out of the fetal position and go invest. Like now's the time. These are the good years. That's the point I've been making and where I think geopolitics is still valuable.
Oh, it's extremely valuable. And so when you think about like what my book is really about, it's about, look, you need to fade the bearish forecasts. So, many of my clients, they believe, and many people who listen to me on podcasts believe I have like a bullish bias. No, it's just a sucker's game to try to predict something bad happening. I just don't want to be in that game. I've made massive mistakes. I underestimated the probability of Russian total invasion of Ukraine.
You and me both.
And others didn't, so God bless them, they got that right. But my point is this, it is very difficult to predict when the timing of something going wrong. So shorting, selling, expecting an increase in geopolitical risk premium is a sucker's game. But once it happens, the money in the way you make money out of geopolitical alpha is realizing that the half-life of geopolitical risk premium is much shorter in almost every case. The world never ends. You know,
Yeah.
like the world doesn't end. And by the way, if it does, it's fine. We're all dead. So, and so, you know, like last year, the two calls that I made that, you know, I almost got canceled for was going long European industrials relative to American. I went long Europe, shorted the US, September. That trades up 14%. Since then, Europe, you could have just gone long Europe without shorting anything, which probably would have made more sense, and long the euro since September. So that was based on this, like, hey man, like the cover of The Economist is telling us Europe is going to deindustrialize. Go the other way.
As soon as The Economist had that cover, I went long Germany right then and there.
just wrong. Like this idea of Germans are going to deindustrialize is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. So anyways, okay, we don't have to spend on that. But you're absolutely right. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities. Europe is being revitalized. The combination of COVID and Ukraine war has put to end EU integration into Europe. Like those things are done. You know, like the euro was always Europe's geopolitical gambit. They were always integrating for geopolitical reasons. They didn't really know why, but the election of Donald Trump, which gave Europe a little insight into an adversarial America.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, you know? And then Russia invading Ukraine. Those two events have truly proven Angela Merkel's statement after she flew home from meeting Trump in Sicily, first time, when she flew home and told, in a Munich beer hall, by the way, let's just leave that aside, but that's the fact. She flew straight to Munich, went to a beer hall, and told CSU, like party leadership, we are on our own. Those were her words. We are on our own. I saw the future. Like I looked at Trump in the eyes and I realized that we are on our own. Now, that might have been resolved a little bit. Transatlantic alliance has been bolstered by Ukraine. I think that's temporary. The point is that what you're describing is a world in which Europe finally understands that they can't mess around with European integration. Once that is resolved, there's all sorts of other things that are going to do well. And I think you're absolutely right. Whether it's Central Eastern Europe, whether it's Germany, the Balkans you mentioned, you have a very interesting situation right now that probably nobody knows about. Right? I don't really follow Serbian politics at all because they're not macro relevant. But as, you know, the fact that I was born there, it's very interesting that there are tensions between Serbia and Kosovo. And it was really the first time ever that the US and the EU have decided to reprimand both sides, but particularly Kosovo. Yeah. So Kosovo was ejected from a very important military exercise that they were going to participate in. And that suggests that you're right, Jacob. Basically, Europe is saying, like, look, let's just wrap this up. You know, let's wrap this region up. Like, oh, the leader of Serbia is kind of a nationalist. Yeah, we don't care. You know, like, we don't want any more pockets of instability on this continent. Let's wrap it up. And you're right, that could be potentially positive for a lot of parts of the continent.
Yeah, it wasn't just I was following this too. It was a last minute addition to my sort of weekly recap last week, and I've been following it closely this week. It wasn't just expelling Kosovo from those military exercises. The U.S. has also come out and said, and we're suspending any cooperation for getting recognition for Kosovo's independence from anybody else, which I don't know what they're doing in Kosovo. Like, you just lost your big gun. And I mean, you could just sort of hear the Western machine looking at Serbia and just seeing the opportunity that's been waiting there sort of in Russia's sphere of influence. And I think it's also not a coincidence that the European Commission, I'm sure Ursula was at GlobeSec today. It's May 31st again. And she said, we have a plan for the Western Balkans and for a cession for the Western Balkans, which the only country that's going to need convincing there is France, because Macron has been saying, I want reform before I want a cession. But maybe he's going to be willing to turn it around. But I think you're right. It's not a coincidence that all this is happening, and it's not a coincidence in all these borderlands where Russia used to be the major power that you're seeing monumental changes.
Well, and you know what, Jacob? So here's something that I think is happening that is really important to understand. Brexit has something to do with this as well. One of the reasons that Polish economy and stocks and assets are doing so well is because there's this return of entrepreneurs from the UK to Poland. And UK basically elected to leave the EU for the one reason that the EU really benefited the UK. And you know, I did an analysis in 2015 and basically argued that the largest consequence of leaving the EU will be that the UK will be a high inflationary economy because their potential GDP growth rate collapses without EU migrant labor force growth. So when you think about labor force growth in the UK pre-Brexit, it was almost 70% reliant in EU migrants. It wasn't third country nationals like Syrian refugees or whatever, which was the big populist stake. It was really Polish and Romanian migrants moving to the UK. And that allowed UK to have the access capacity needed to not be an inflationary economy. Now they're hitting constraints like this, and you see what's happening in the UK. It's the only country in the Western world that has a wage price spiral. Its CPI is still at double digits. Its inflation is at double digits. And so I think that what's happening is that realization in Europe, that's the consequence of populism. That's the consequence of a truly anti-globalization burst of populism. That combined with the fact that Europe has digested and internalized millions of Ukrainian refugees with really no negative consequences politically. I think that then you look around and you're like, wait, how many Serbs are there? Like 8 million? Like, whatever. Like, let's do. Sure. Bring them on. Like how many people in Bosnia? Like 4 million? Okay, whatever. Like Kosovo is like what, 2 million? Let's wrap it up. What's the difference? What's another 20 million people going to do, especially as Germany and Italy and Spain age like really massively? And so I think you're absolutely right. This is an easy fix, and it will be a huge feather in Europe's cap, especially if we could wrap Serbia up. Because then Russia, like the Western press continues to call Russia a Serbian ally. It's not. Like that's just Western propaganda and like not having the nuance. Serbia is trying to do exactly what it should be. I would argue in a multipolar world. Now that we know it's a multipolar world, playing all sides against one another is perfect. Buying Chinese surface-to-air missiles was like coup de grace, like excellent. The more the merrier, because you bid up your price. Yep. And I think that you're absolutely right. This is an interesting thesis. I don't know how investment relevant it is, but it's an interesting development.
Well, I think there are ways around it. So, I mean, at CI, I'll just plug a report that we just did, and which is in some of our strategies, which is you're exactly right about the UK, and the greatest benefactor of it is right next door, Ireland. I got to write in the research piece we just put out for the first time in Ireland's entire history, the geopolitics are good for the Emerald Island. And like, that's true. It's literally never been good for them. And they get to do it because, the UK would be better led by a head of lettuce. But the second part that I would talk about is, with the thing about just wrapping it up in the Western Balkans, like you are going to start to traipse on Turkey's ideas of what it's supposed to be, especially with Bosnia, especially, when you start to get into that, like Turkey's been thinking about that and wanting to expand there for a while. So it's lurking, and Turkey's part of, the investment thesis there as well. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't think Turkey will look kindly on just the EU trying to slowly wrap them in. I think you're going to have some objections from them.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult though, because, if Serbia starts getting in, I think Albania, Kosovo, and Bosnia will say, wait a minute, like this makes no sense that we don't follow that path. And this is what's interesting about the EU. There's a lot of critics of the EU, a lot of critics around the world, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, obviously in the US as well. But it's an empirical fact that countries that join the EU do better than those that don't. Like, quality of life. Like, I'm from Eastern Europe. I have gone to Warsaw. Like, I think last time I was in Warsaw was a long time ago. It was like 2010, 2009. And even then, it looked like any city in Germany. There are clear, but no, obviously income inequality goes up. Reforms are painful. Industries get, there are definitely downsides to these reforms to get to the EU, but quality of life for the median citizen absolutely goes up. Romania versus Moldova. No competition. Yeah. Ukraine versus Poland. No competition. And by the way, there was competition. When all of these countries were behind the Iron Curtain, Ukraine and Poland were relatively equivalent. Or, Serbia versus Croatia, same thing. So I think that, and again, there is a rising Euroscepticism in Central and Eastern Europe, in Croatia too. Lots of debts were incurred for infrastructure development. I understand this. I know this. I'm sensitive to it. It's just that, look, bottom line, EU is a very attractive alliance. And I think that they will continue to persist and create investment opportunities potentially in these countries. Difficult for a lot of my clients to play this, but definitely some of the more nimble family office, smaller investors who want to get, maybe into some privates, into some real estate. Those would be interesting.
It's difficult for now, but to your point, this is where you sort of, if you see the opportunities coming, you want to keep some powder dry because, I'm talking to folks that are more nimble and I'm hearing things like, hey, let's set up a fund to go get distressed agricultural assets in Ukraine. Let's go think about Ukrainian government bond. Now, all of this is, too aggressive for my blood and for the things that we're doing, but I hear it and there are ancillary, the Polish bet, the German industrial bet, that there are things that you can do on the sideline of it as well. Marko, we have about 10, 15 more minutes max left, and I want to be sure we talk about basketball. But before we do, any other topic you want to hit or any other country you want to hit? I've become enamored with Indonesia lately, but I'm happy to give you 5-10 minutes to riff on anything else that you want to before we talk about your the Lakers.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Indonesia is something that we're extremely bullish. We wrote a very in-depth piece on it last year. And I think that in this multipolar world, emerging markets stand to benefit for a lot of reasons. There's a capex cycle, commodities. Once we get through this cyclical bottom, I think we are going to be in a commodity super cycle. So those are kind of traditional reasons you want to be long EM. Dollar bear market too. I'm on that train. But for me, really, from a geopolitical perspective, the reason I want to be in emerging markets like Indonesia is that they figured it out. They figured out that they are children of divorced parents, and they're going to get 2 Christmases, 2 Hanukkahs, 2 Easters, 2 everything, 2 birthdays.
Maybe more than 2.
And they're playing it hard. And more than 2 perhaps. And they're playing it hard. And Joko Widodo and the administration in Indonesia, they just don't care. They are open. They're in your face about it. They invited, Putin to the G20 summit, and then they banned nickel exports, which really hurt China. China didn't retaliate. China sent $20 billion worth of FDI to develop their refining. The next step they're going to do is they're going to ban refined nickel export and force China to move its battery factories to Indonesia. Then they're going to ban the export of that and force China to move its car manufacturing to Indonesia. And the thing is, no one can do anything to them. Because every single country wants the global south, as it's called, to be on their side. And this is important because in the 1960s and 70s, it was very difficult for non-aligned countries to play this game. It was very difficult because, first of all, the world was not multipolar, it was bipolar. And second of all, very few of them had the strategic depth or importance to play both sides against one another. My homeland of Yugoslavia did this brilliantly and lived off of this. But for the most part, non-aligned countries were not important enough. Today, this strategy will absolutely work because it is a multipolar world, because they are larger in terms of economic potential as percent of global GDP. And I think Indonesia is at the forefront of what's going on. People focus on India almost too much. I think Indonesia is actually a better place. So I 100% agree.
Well, yeah, I don't think India has the right profile. I was sort of very skeptical of Indonesia, but you sort of notice the way things are turning also in their direction. Like if you go back to IMF reports or World Bank reports from 2010 to 2020, Indonesia's like they did everything wrong. They're scaring away foreign investment. They're too protectionist, this, that, and the other thing. And I noted today the Philippines voting to set up their own sovereign wealth fund, and Marcos, Mr. Bong Bong, as they call him there, that's literally his nickname. He said, we're doing the Indonesia model. We want to go after the Indonesia model. Now, I don't think the Philippines can do it. I don't think they have the resources, but just the idea that there's this, Indonesia is something we can emulate. And I think the profile of countries that do well in this emerging market world, it's those ones that have commodities and have enough political will to do what we're talking about. So it's a Brazil, it's an Indonesia. India has sort of different challenges there. If South Africa could ever get its shit together, like South Africa has the right profile that we're talking about here. And the last thing I would just say is, this is also why you need to be really picky. Like if you just go to the emerging markets ETF, that's still like 50% China. Like there are actually very, very few vehicles out there for attacking some of these opportunities. You just have to do a little bit of hard work and then actually think about custody and all those other things. So,
well, the other issue also is that a lot of the equity indices, are overrepresented by financials. Or things that, they should do well if, terms of trade are positive. The rising tide will lift all boats. But you're absolutely right. The index composition does not always reflect the most interesting stories. So I actually prefer to play these mega themes, through three vehicles. One, the bond market, if it's liquid enough. Two, currencies. And three, privates. So that's obviously difficult for just, individual investors. But for institutional investors, they need to get creative, and they need to start investing in managers and private equity vehicles that will get them exposed to places like Indonesia, the CapEx cycle, and that means not getting on a plane to San Francisco to talk to someone at Sand Hill Road. It means about getting a little bit more creative about how you deploy your alternative assets.
Yeah. All right. 6 minutes. Tell me about the Lakers. I mean, I feel like you've got Jokic though, so it was really you won either way. It's kind of not fair.
It is. This is this is downside protection, right? Like, but look, I think when you look at what the media narratives, like Economist covers, you could run a hedge fund off of it. I may launch a hedge fund that will just be called the anti-economist cover, and I think I could raise like $1 billion like this.
Well, yeah, I forget how many assets the anti-Jim Cramer ETF has, so it's basically just a version of that, right?
It's just that, yeah. So look, I mean, similarly, the media narrative right now is Boston Celtics disastrous season, Lakers disastrous season, but I think in both cases it's a little overstated. They got top four. The Lakers were in it every game against the Nuggets. It was close every game, and the Celtics, they lost Game 7, granted at home, and also some other.
I think that's a little me against us. Maybe that's the Serbian. I think everybody respects what the Lakers did. Nobody expected them to be there. It is disastrous for the Celtics, and I have an interest in everybody saying it's disastrous because I would like Jaylen Brown to be cheap for the Pelicans to acquire with our Lakers draft picks. So I need you to keep on talking up how bad it is for the Celtics, please.
I mean, look, I think what I would do is I would run it back again with the Celtics. I would give it one more shot with the Brown Tatum experiment, and then then you have to give him the supermax $50 million, and then he's an asset, and you trade him to somewhere. And but like they got to the finals last year, they were one game away from the finals this year. So I think that, and by the way, if they do decide to go another way, like for example sending Brown to the Pelicans or Houston or whatever the case is, what I would do if I was the Celtics is I would go backwards. I wouldn't try to get Dame Lillard, which is like this, trade everyone was talking about. I would do what the Celtics did with the Paul Pierce years, where they took 2 years backwards and then got the right trade with KG. There will be a disgruntled superstar in the next 5 years. Giannis, Luka, somebody.
Yeah, but the problem is it could be Tatum.
Well, I know, and obviously you want to make sure Tatum is on board with this plan. Paul Pierce, they did that with Pierce. They missed, I think, the playoffs in one of those years. So that's the one thing I would say with the Celtics. As far as the Lakers are concerned, look, I mean, there's nothing you can really do as long as LeBron and AD are on the team. The cap space is what it is. Austin Reeves is going to cost a lot of money, but there will be LA riots if he is shipped. So, I don't know. I'm okay with it. I'm okay with what happened. I think what's interesting, the real storyline for me is that, the Denver Nuggets could be at a cusp of a dynasty like the Warriors. Because there's this lull. I don't know if you feel it too, Jacob. There's like a lull in the NBA right now. The Bucks are in flux for whatever reason. Philly is a failed experiment that will implode, I think, within 12 months. You have, on the other side, the Warriors are too old, and they're in flux as well. I think they are done. The Lakers, over the hill, obviously, interesting, but Memphis is a mess. Really, the Kings are kind of the only team with a brightish future in the West. So I think that there's this 2 to 3 year lull, which is all you need to create a dynasty. It's going to be, if they stay healthy, the Nuggets could have 3 in a row. Just because I don't know. And if you're willing to break up the Celtics so quickly as everybody is, I'm the only one that's saying, run it one more year. In part because of this lull idea, why not? Just do the same thing. Who's going to challenge you? Hopefully you don't run into Miami Heat again. My point is, I think the Nuggets, could really dominate because of all this flux and all this movement. Suns, I don't think the Suns can do it too much. KD is not who he was. They traded everyone for him. So I don't know. What do you think about
I wouldn't sleep on Phoenix, but I love what's happened so far in the NBA because it's been such a victory for team basketball and for continuity and for coaching. Like it's so nice that we have the two best teams, and like Miami, like they have dudes out there I've never even heard of, and I'm a pretty obsessed basketball fan, and they're doing good stuff. And the Nuggets, like it's just continuity. They've been there for years. They trusted. They've got a coach that they all listen to. You could say the same thing about the Kings. That's one of the reasons the Kings are interesting because you see the makings of a team there that actually functions and works together. We're down in New Orleans. If Zion could stay healthy for a year, I think he would eat the league, but he's going to have to prove that he can stay healthy first. So
I'll tell you this, man. Pelicans fans, you guys are like equity bears. You know, I would have made a lot of money if the Fed hadn't done QE. I have a lot of Pelican fans in my life, and all I hear from them is a lot of chirping, especially with a Laker pick. Yeah, how did that work out? Second of all I hear from them is like, if we only stay healthy.
Marko, we still have more picks, and we have BI. Like it's a little too early to take your victory lap, my friend.
We have a banner from 2020. So I'm perfectly fine with the trade. We won the trade.
We have to put an asterisk by it, because it's in the bubble.
Oh, then we can. Yeah, asterisk by saying this is one of the most difficult titles ever. But like, leave that aside. Look. All I'm saying is this. Saying if the Pelicans are healthy is like saying if only the Fed hadn't done QE, I would have made a lot of money. Like there will not be a year where the Pelicans are healthy. This is the day. I think they went all in on players who are just not going to be healthy. Victor. Okay, so I want to get two things before we go. I know we got to go, but two things. Victor Wembanyama, same thing. I'm very concerned that 7'5", 7'6" dude with like apparently foot problems is just not going to be what people think he is. And the second thing I want to ask you is like, okay, let's make some predictions for the finals. So go. What do you think about the Spurs, Wembanyama, and then who are we picking for the finals? And what is the score?
I feel like the Spurs are a frontier economy. It's North Korea. I haven't seen the doctor's notes. They're gonna. It's too close to the chest. Like I don't have the intelligence. So somebody who has the doctor's notes, like you can make the call. I'll just sit here and see if they're able to lob some missiles that actually work or satellites into space. Wait. What was the second question? It was.
We got to make a call. Like it's.
Yeah. I mean. Remember, I said it was going to be Pelicans-Bucks in the finals and that the Bucks were going to win in 4. So I will say a gentleman's sweep. I think it's Nuggets 4-1. Yeah, I think Jimmy will pull one out. Will pull one out of his ass.
I think tomorrow's the game.
Yes, tomorrow's game 1.
The Nuggets have been sitting on the sidelines. You know, Jokic has been eating a lot of like nice Serbian treats. If the Heat are going to win a game, it's going to be Thursday, and if they don't beat the Nuggets in the first game, I will be shocked if they make it even close in a single game.
They're coming off Game 7 and it's mile high, so it's going to be hard.
No, but here's the thing: I love Jimmy Butler. He embodies everything that I believe in terms of life, in terms of motivating teammates. I mean, I love Jimmy Butler. Saying that they're going to get crushed is no knock on the Heat, their culture, or Jimmy Butler. I love them. I wish he could win the ring, but I just don't see. They don't have the human capital to go against Jokic. And one thing I like about Jokic is he is willing to take you in the post and use his fat ass when he feels that he has to. And so that's gonna happen. But one last thing I want to say: you said something really, really smart and really cool. You said it's a win for team basketball, and I think one of the reasons that the best 5 players in the NBA are basically Europeans, is that this, AAU basketball, this whole like, I want to be like Steph Curry or like shoot jumpers. There's no passing. Everyone's one-on-one. That's a problem. And I think what's interesting is I was shooting some hoops last night with my son. And this kid was right next to us on the court next to us, and he was practicing like the Sombor shuffle. He was doing the Jokic turnaround, and he was doing post-up moves. And I just see the pendulum swinging. Steph Curry, I think the problem with the Warriors is that they were so good at shooting that they made it seem like it's easy to win. But we saw with the Celtics, the variance is too high with three-pointers. You need more than that. And I think that the pendulum is swinging back towards that cool post play, the passing, the team basketball. And I'm really excited about that because I think that will save basketball and make it watchable again.
All right, cousin Marko, I gotta run. Thanks for coming on. We'll talk to you soon, all right?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.